This is Social Studies, Chapter 8, Lesson 3. That's going to talk about some of the early history and past of the Southwest region. And up at the top of page 268, there's some pictures of, or there's a picture of some carvings in the wall of a canyon that were done by Native Americans. And it says in this picture, it shows some of the Spanish settlers arriving, is what these symbols are depicting. And those are some common sites that you would see down in certain areas of the Southwest where these Native American groups lived. So why don't you go ahead and pause the video and read what's on this page, and we'll talk a little bit about it. So what it talked about on this page is that in the Southwest there have been fossils found that prove that there were Native American groups living in this area over 10,000 years ago. There's been some very old fossils found. And other than finding a few of these fossils, it says scientists don't know a whole lot about those groups from that early on, but they have found more evidence of groups that were a little bit more recent, and some of that evidence being like these cliff dwellings that you see in this picture here. There are several different spots in the Southwest where there are areas that have canyons, cliffs, and things like that. And several of these Native American groups, what they did was build these homes up in the side of cliffs, and it was really to protect their villages, because not only are they high up and difficult to get to, but then they can see for a long ways, and so if there was enemy coming, they would likely be able to see them a long ways out. And so it mentions some of these being in New Mexico, some of them in Arizona. There is one in southern Colorado also that I have been to, called Mesa Verde, and it's just very, very cool to look at, because there are tours that take you up through some of the ones that are more well preserved. Some you can't go into because they're falling apart too much, but you can even stand on one side of this canyon and look across to the other, and it's just amazing to think how these Native Americans built these on these steep cliffs by hand. It was just an amazing feat. Then, if we go on to the next page, it's going to talk a little bit more about some of the Native American groups that lived there. So why don't you go ahead and pause it and read this. So on this page, it mentions several different Native American groups and their names. And if you notice, a lot of them were farmers in this area, despite the fact that it was, kind of hot, dry, deserty area in some of these places. They were able to create these canals that they could irrigate their fields with. So a lot of times they would either build their villages next to a river valley, because if it's in a river valley, there's going to be more water, and the land is likely to be not as dry. But even if they were further away from the river valley, they dug these canals that transported some of the river water to where they needed it to go. And so if you look at this map, you can see there are several groups that were over there in Arizona, a couple in New Mexico, and then it shows a couple in Texas as well. It doesn't show any in Oklahoma. It doesn't mean necessarily that there weren't any. And even today now, especially in large parts of New Mexico, some parts of Arizona, in Oklahoma, there are many Native American reservations, just like we have a few here, many in South Dakota, so we've talked about those before, that land set aside to be ruled by those specific Native American groups. So a lot of them were farmers, but it does say a few of them moved in, like the Apache and Comanche moved in from the north. They're over in Texas. And they were more nomadic people. They didn't necessarily farm and stay in one place. they moved around a little bit more, it says. But if you look at number 1 here, it's a question that's asking us about the map. It says, underline on the map each of the tribes named in the text. So if we go back and we're looking, there was a couple that were mentioned on the other page. It mentioned the Puebloans. So up there by where it says Rocky Mountains, that should be underlined. It mentions even some of them that are not on the map here. It mentions Hopi, Zuni, Pima, Mojave is on there, Apache, Comanche. So many of them that are listed on the map are underlined. It might be easier to do it this way. The only ones that they don't mention, the only ones that wouldn't be underlined, are the Papago over in southern Arizona, and then it never says anything about the Wichita in the text either. So everything else, all those other Native American groups, should be underlined. Now, if we go on to the next page, it talks about the first explorers that reached this area were the Spanish. So why don't you go ahead and pause the video and read this page, and we'll talk about what's on it. So on this page, it says it was in the early 1500s that the Spanish first arrived in the area. And the way that they came to the area is they actually landed in like the Mexico area first and claimed that for Spain. So at the time it was called New Spain. And just like the United States gained our independence from Great Britain, Mexico gained their independence from Spain and became their own country at one time as well. But at this time it was claimed for Spain, and so they started building colonies there and going a little up further north into our Arizona, New Mexico, Texas area. Because if you remember, at this time, none of that is claimed by the United States. Everything is still being explored. The United States is not even our own country yet. Everything that has been claimed is just colonies. And so this is before Lewis and Clark made their expedition and all of that. There's these Spanish explorers that landed first in Mexico and then traveled north. One of the first ones being Cabeza de Vaca. His group had quite a hard time. It says they landed on the coast of Texas there in the Gulf of Mexico, but through disease and all these other things that happened to their group, only a couple of them, including himself, survived. And so there was one other man with him that, as survivors, they set off to try and find Mexico City, because the Spanish there was all these legends among Spanish explorers about these cities of gold and all the riches you can find in this area. And so that was one of their main goals, was to find all of these riches, find these cities of gold. Well, they came to find out later, once they'd been searching and searching, that they didn't exist. But the Spanish goal, or their motto when they were coming over as explorers, was gold, God, and glory. So they were looking for the gold. As Spanish, many of them also were Catholics, and so there were some priests among these groups that were spreading the word of God and trying to convert Native Americans and people that they came across to the Catholic religion. And also they were looking for glory for their country. So that was their goals. And so it says this Estevan that was with Cabeza de Vaca and a priest, Father Marcos de Niza, were out together looking for these cities of gold. And as they were traveling in the distance, they thought they saw something that looked like a city of gold because, in this deserty area where it's hot, we've all seen kind of that mirage type when you can see the heat rising off the cement when it's a really hot day. They're out traveling in the middle of a desert and they see one of these Native American villages that's built out of this, Pueblo clay, and it's got that mirage-y type look, and so it almost looks like it's sparkling in the sun. So to them, they thought it was a city of gold, but once they actually got there, realized that's not what it was. And so eventually they found out that these cities of gold, the Cibola, didn't actually exist, but that was one thing that they had been looking for. So number 2 says, underline the effects of the arrival of Cabeza de Vaca and Esteban in Mexico City. So the fact that they made it to Mexico City, what happened because of that? And there's actually 2 things. If you look in the second paragraph here, maybe I'll just put a pin there if I can. Or maybe I'll highlight it. Here we go. One effect, because they made it to Mexico City, Esteban and Father Deniza set out to find these cities of gold. That's one thing that happened because they made it to Mexico City. Another thing that happened was, let's see, the governor in 1540 sent Coronado to find these cities of gold as well. And like we said, they eventually found out that they do not exist. But that's what we should have underlined there. Now, if we go on to the next page, this talks about these Spanish explorers actually building settlements in this area. So once you pause the video and read this page. So on this page, it talked about the fact that some of these Spanish explorers, even though others had discovered that these cities of gold didn't exist, some of them never gave up on that idea and were still looking for them. One of them was Juan de Oñate. So he led some settlers north, and they would build settlements. And like I mentioned before, a lot of them, these groups, would have Catholic priests with them. And so what they would build, these settlements were called missions. And because they were staffed by missionaries who were spreading the word of God, especially to the Native Americans that lived in the area. And it says a lot of them that went north with this goal went back to Mexico because they got scared of the groups of Native Americans that lived there. But some of them did stay and build missions. And a lot of the missions looked similar to this picture that it shows you on the bottom here. They put up walls around it for their own protection. And then they would have, some things they might farm, like they've got an orchard outside the wall there, their own flour mill so that they could grow wheat and make bread. Then they've got the church is the main center there. They've got some livestock that they're raising, a small garden. But the main center of these missions was the church, because that was their goal, was to convert these Native Americans to Christianity. And so it says sometimes these missions, when they were set up next to groups of Native Americans that lived there, they treated them very well. They invited them in, they offered them protection, and then while they were there, taught them about God. Other groups were not as nice. And sometimes they would enslave the Native Americans and force them to work on their mission. So it just depended, I guess, on which groups it was. Some of them treated the Native Americans better than others. And so that's why still today, in the Southwest area, we've got all these towns with Spanish names that when they started out, that's what they were Spanish missions. You've got San Jose here, San Antonio, Santa Fe, Corpus Christi. There's all kinds of them. I could go on and on. But most likely, if it's a town down there in the Southwest and it has a Spanish name, it's pretty likely that it started out as a Spanish mission. So let's look at number 3 here. It says, draw conclusions, look at the mission, and write clues that show the people on missions grew or made most of what they needed. Well, if we look at the picture, there's several things that we mentioned here that some of the clues would be there is a garden. Oops. An orchard. There are livestock, which would be like cattle or pigs that they're raising. And then the flour mill is also another clue, because then they would have been able to make their own bread, because they could grind wheat into flour. Now, on the next page, it's going to talk about the culture down in the Southwest. So go ahead and pause it and read this page. So on this page, it talks about the fact that the Southwest, their culture is largely influenced by 3 different groups, those 3 groups being the Spanish, Mexican, and then the Native Americans that lived down in that area. And that makes sense because, the Spanish explorers were the first ones in that area, and that land, especially Mexico, which is right next to the Southwest there, was originally owned by Spain. And I think we've talked about this before, but, parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, those all belonged to Mexico at one time before they were part of the United States. And so, in this area, there's a lot of people that have Mexican or Spanish ancestors, or their ancestors were members of those groups of Native Americans that lived in the area. And so certain traditions, foods, things like that have been passed down amongst families, and so there's still a big deal in the culture down there, but it's kind of a mix of those 3 cultures. And so you've got a lot of people that speak Spanish in that area because you're right next to Mexico. They celebrate certain Mexican holidays because, there's so many people from Mexico that live there and they're so close to Mexico. So Cinco de Mayo, and then the Mexican Independence Day when they won their independence from Spain is also, just like we celebrate the 4th of July, theirs is September 16th. And that's another big celebration down there. And then you've got, these Native American reservations all over where there's still, the Native American cultures are still alive and thriving down there, and they still carry on some of their same traditions, some of their art forms, and things like that. And then there's a picture of a woman here in a traditional Mexican outfit doing a dance, probably at one of the celebrations there. So number 4 says, underline 3 of the different cultures in the Southwest, then write a conclusion about which one you think influences the region the most. So if we're looking for the 3, we mentioned those 3 there. The 3 cultures that are big down there are Spanish, Mexican, and Native American. So that's what we would underline. And, the second part of this could kind of be an opinion question if you have a different opinion. But to me, the way I look at it is that probably the Mexican culture influences it the most because it's so close to Mexico. Oops. And, many people speak Spanish. And eat Mexican foods. And finally, we've got the last page here. If you want to pause and read about some of the things you might see when you visit the Southwest. So on this page, it talks about culturally some things you would see and experience when you visit the Southwest. Obviously, in the lesson on the land, we talked about, seeing the desert area, the Grand Canyon, things like that. But also when you're down in this area, culturally, some things you would experience are, probably Mexican food, music, festivals. Sometimes, people go to visit some of the Spanish missions that are still standing in some of these cities. Or, like I said, the Mesa Verde, where they have preserved some of these Native American cliff dwellings, you can go see. Or you could, go through Native American reservation and they've got artwork and things like that there in those places. And so there are many of these things that you would see culturally when you're down there as well. And there's a picture of a Native American woman here. It says, weavings, pottery, and jewelry made by Navajo artists are popular with collectors. And so you can see she's wearing some of that jewelry. This would be something that she weaved. It doesn't show any pottery here, but that's another big art form that these Native Americans created. So your job will be to answer number 5 and 6 on this page 273. First one wants to know, how did the arrival of Spanish settlers change the lives of Native Americans? So when these Spanish settlers moved in and built these missions, how did that affect the Native Americans that lived in that area? And then number 6, let's see. This you're going to have to go back to the Midwest chapter to find an answer for, because it wants to know which Native American groups live or lived in your area, being Minnesota. What would you like to learn about them? So if you flip back to, let me see if I can find a page number for you to help look. So the page that could be helpful for this would be page 234 and 235. There's a map that has names of Native American groups. There's only one that's listed in Minnesota, but you can pick any of the ones that lived in the Midwest and write what would you like to learn about them and one question you would ask if you were able to visit that group.